First, I'd like to thank Jake and Chris for putting together this this conference. It was really great. I'm from Cleveland. I work with Black Box Network Services. If everybody remembers the old catalog of all the switches and stacks and things of that nature. I run the security practice, and I've been with the organization a few years at this point. I've been in the InfoSec industry, and I'm going to take a, let's see here. I'm going to take a little page from a guy named Chris Nickerson. These are my credentials. And essentially, I've been in the InfoSec industry for 21 years. I really got a charge out of Alex Hutton's keynote yesterday, because not necessarily for all the content, which was spectacular, but there was a picture of my first boss in his slide deck. My first boss in the IT industry. So in 1992, I was at Case Western Reserve, my senior year up in Cleveland. I was introduced to a guy named Dr. Peter Tippett. So at the time, he was, he had a small little upstart company called Certus International that basically what we did, and he was my kind of mentor for my senior project at Case. But we were designing, that was all antivirus technology. So I got to work with him for a couple of years, or for a year or so, and that was my intro into information security 21 years ago. Disassembling antivirus code and figuring out, what to, or how to get it off systems. Over the last 21 years, I've had a ton of certifications, but after recertifying my GSEC 3 times, and I taught it twice, certifications at this point. I've been doing this 21 years, and part of the job description is for InfoSec, jaded and cynical, and at this point, that's pretty much where we are. The typical disclaimer: I'm not representing my company in any way, shape, or form, but for the express purposes of this presentation, this is kind of setting the expectations. I do, as part of my job description, I do penetration testing. I specialize in business risk, business systems analysis, business impact analysis, and while I do on occasion break into systems, this is not what this talk is about. This isn't about any new cool tools. I'm going to talk a lot about the second half of this presentation. I'm going to be talking a lot about natural systems. So stay with me, because it gets kind of cool. We're going to, and the bottom line is, I like feedback. The presentation itself is probably going to run a little shorter than the expressed amount of time here, but the primary reason for that is I like a lot of interaction and feedback, and this topic I found, it's evolved from a talk that I gave last year at DerbyCon, and it does have the capability of getting into some really interesting conversations in terms of how people are kind of adapting, how businesses are adapting to this, ever-changing environment of vulnerability, threat, and risk to organizations. So the first half of this talk is about conflict. And does anybody who hasn't seen this presentation before, the first few slides are directly from a previous talk. But does anybody here know what this date represents? Sorry? No, close. Yeah. So June 5th, 1942 represents the last time the United States declared war. And it was with these three companies, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, as part of World War II, the Axis powers. So that effectively represents the last clean conflict that our country has gotten involved in. The following years are what we'll call unclean conflicts. And as you can see, we're pretty good at them. We have a long and unprecedented history of engaging in what we're going to call unclean conflicts. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that we've been involved in. Excuse me. This next date represents an equally, I would say, important period in our country's history. Oh, thanks, Brian. Does anybody know what this date is? Yahtzee! Ding, 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 winner. Does anybody have an idea what this actual date represents? This was the day the Soviet Union fell. Okay? Officially, I guess. You know, apparently it was coming for some time. And there were, you know, from a global events perspective, that it does represent quite a few things. But in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today, the ramifications of that event have some really, really interesting, now we're talking about, you know, hindsight, but have some really, really interesting impact in terms of our business culture, right? So after the fall of the Soviet Union, what country in their right mind would realistically engage in any type of formal conflict with, at this time, the only superpower left in you know, on the planet? Nobody. I mean, why would you even need to do such a thing when through small-scale unofficial conflicts, espionage, terrorism, things of that nature, you can accomplish your goals or even surpass your goals. At this point in time, now fast forwarding to today, our adversaries have become much better at executing unclean conflicts against us, which completely baffles me at some point when I think about it, because we're so, historically, we've been so good at doing that type of activity. So how did we suddenly basically find ourselves with our pants around our ankles in terms of the data theft that we're seeing today, in terms of, you know, both corporate as well as nation-state espionage? And, you know, I promise I'll keep count of some of the drinking, the drinking buzzwords, but our cyber conflicts, right? We're now just to the point where, probably more thanks to the media than anything else, that over the last, I'll say, 3 to 5 years, now we're really, really coming to grips with the term, you know, with this fact that, wow, we completely missed the boat on cyber unclean conflicts. Everybody else is just kicking our butt from that perspective. So that's all well and good, but how does that relate to business? And this is where this first part of this talk, I'm going to kind of try to make this point. And this is theory A, right? This mindset of who would realistically confront us as a nation really kind of filtered down into our business DNA. And that you know, as far as I'm concerned, a business arrogance developed out of that, that basically our business leaders now have, post Cold War, post the fall of the Soviet Union, have developed this complete arrogance within the business culture of, well, who in their right mind would realistically go against what we're doing, as well as dictating to the rest of the world how to do that from a business perspective, right? And who really believes that the rest of the planet is going to basically say, oh, hello, big business from the United States. We're going to do whatever you want to do and how you want us to do it. And it doesn't work like that. There's no incentive, and just given the nature of the internet and combining that with the concept of unclean conflict, it's the rest of the world is essentially no, we don't want to do any of that. Josh Corman had a great little blurb here that I'm stealing. Why spend billions of dollars developing technology when you can purchase that stolen technology or steal it for $1 million? And that's a really, really valid point. He's a really smart guy too. If you don't know who he is, go find his blog. It's a cognitive dissonance. So yeah, why would the rest of our competition and our adversaries really care about how we think they should run their business? And now, with basically this expertise in digital unclean conflicts, making it so easy to even the playing field, what's the incentive for like behavior? What's the incentive for them to behave? There is none. This is one of my favorite terms, organizational entropy. The natural result of assuming that you are smarter than your adversaries. It illustrates in two words very elegantly, in my opinion, the state of our business culture, and now why we are essentially trying to fix our own arrogance in the face of a lot of this, a lot of the theft of intellectual property, etc. I just purely from a business perspective, I'm focusing on, let's say, intellectual property, intellectual capital, as opposed to maybe more the criminal side of the house from a profit perspective, just because from my perspective, in my opinion, it's more interesting, right? So now our pants are around our ankles. What's been the reaction, right? Well, I apologize to our sponsors, but one of the biggest reactions is to buy more blinky things, right? Different technologies, etc. We're talking now with organizations who are promoting hackback, okay? So instead of kind of sitting back and doing damage control and following your incident response procedures and business continuity, etc., you've got people who are now promoting go after your attackers. That's an interesting argument. I'm not really sure I support it, but it is what it is. And legislation, right? So in order to mitigate things that we have completely ignored over, I don't know, let's just say for argument's sake, the round number's 20 years, right? In order to mitigate that, now we have things like SOPA and CISPA and things of that nature that are mitigating attempts, right? And the bottom line is, in my opinion, if you get to the point where a problem becomes so big that you need to legislate it in order to fix it and protect, let's say, national as well as global economic states, you've completely missed the point. You've completely missed the boat, right? Sorry. That policy should not dictate society. Society needs to dictate policy, and legislating your problems away never works. But the overarching irony from this, from all of this now is that big business, this whole concept of big business arrogance, has fueled a larger big business of product solutions. And I just kind of like that irony. We've got, a gigantic industry for, the vulnerability databases, the firewalls, and all of that is maybe not all of it is directly related, but a lot of that is related to this whole big business arrogance from everything that I've pretty much laid out here. So my assumption here is that the majority of the people at this event are at least in InfoSec in some way, shape, or form. What's our role, right? Preventing the loss of both replaceable and irreplaceable data. Again, Josh Corman is a really smart guy. He and David Etu, somebody correct me on this. Jericho, do you know David's last name? How do you pronounce David Etu's last name? David Etu, E-T-U-E, no? He and Corman did Etu, thank you. He and Corman did a talk, and they talk about replaceable versus irreplaceable data. I'm just going to tangent on this one. So you've got replaceable data, such like things as credit card numbers, social security numbers, and then you have irreplaceable data like intellectual property. So if your replaceable data gets stolen, it's replaceable, right? As opposed to if your intellectual property gets stolen, that's not replaceable. Promoting innovation, which really means for all intents and purposes, promoting risk within an organization. You really kind of have to and take certain risks for innovation to really be successful, and then protecting the brand, right? So that kind of, from my perspective, that's really what InfoSec is all about. That then really drives these types of, I think these right here, a show of hands. Does anybody know, or has anybody have like actual directives from your business leaders on what your business goals and initiatives are in InfoSec? One. Anybody else? Two, maybe? Okay. That boggles my mind, right? As an InfoSec professional, I need to know what my business wants to do. That communication needs to come down to whatever level of in the organization that you're at in order for us to successfully protect your data, our business critical data. So the initiatives are important for us to be successful. We need to know what then that business critical data is, okay? So, all right, one more show of hands. Who knows what your business critical data is? Couple more people, okay. Do you know where it lives? A few people? You sure about that? Right? I mean, Baitlick said it best, Richard Baitlick from Mandiant. Identity is the new corporate perimeter, right? And I'll talk about the problem with walls in a minute, firewalls and things of that nature. And then who might find value in that data? So these are the things, in my opinion, that are the most important things for InfoSec people to know and understand in order to successfully protect the business itself, right? So this slide is a little generic, right? And the message that I want to convey is really that our InfoSec problems are, naturally related to a larger set of problems. So if our actual focused InfoSec issues are inherently related to larger information problems and common and natural issues, it effectively makes, if we deal with all of our individual, let's say, somebody's trying to break in here, or I have a problem with my firewall, or, what vulnerability is going to have the most effect. If we kind of associate that with an adaptation perspective, we have basically reduced the problem space. We need to think about things a little differently. The unnatural state of things is, I mentioned this earlier, but we've defined an environment where greed and policy is dictating business and society, and regardless of political motivation or opinion or anything like that, that's just a little backwards. Like I said, society needs to dictate policy, not policy dictating society. And the longer that we are accepting kind of this unnatural state, the longer, this window here, right? This window exists for our adversaries to catch up and eventually, if they haven't already, if some haven't already, depending on the business, depending on if we're going to refer to nation state, et cetera, to catch up and surpass us. It's unnatural. And the drivers are, power, greed, et cetera. So this guy, Joel Brenner, wrote this book, America the Vulnerable. Is anybody familiar with this book at all? It's really kind of it's more used these days for FUD by a lot of security vendors. But this one quote was really, really kind of poignant, and I wanted to include this, right? Organizations must learn, and I'm going to emphasize learn here because the second half of this talk is going to be focused on adaptation. And learning and cooperation are key elements to adaptation. So organizations must learn to live in a world where less and less information can be kept secret, and where secret information will remain secret for less and less time. So regardless of your opinion about the book and how it was really kind of intended to scare the bejesus out of everybody, that's a really interesting and very useful kind of tool to keep in mind here. So adaptation, okay? The DBIR is great. I didn't see anything in the 2013 DBIR about undetection percentages, but the 2012 DBIR stated that 92% of the breaches went undetected. That's, to me, that was interesting. So if 92% of the and again, percentages, whatever, if a large percentage of breaches went undetected, is detection, or is better detection, necessarily the answer? We can talk about, all of the associated controls that we have today, from your firewalls, your antivirus, et cetera, but adding or improving existing systems is not adapting. So where does that really kind of leave us? All right, the definition of adaptation is, and according to this guy that I'm going to bring up in a second, it arises from leaving or being forced out of your comfort zone. So, your comfort zone. How does that relate? What's a comfort zone for a business? Can anybody think of, a decent idea of what a comfort zone for a business is, right? Because if as an organization you're not leaving your comfort zone, then there's no incentive to adapt. So this book, some punk named Nickerson mentioned it on one of his podcasts, and it sounded, it's called Learning from the Octopus. You can't really see, yeah, that's a horrible, but it's basically Learning from the Octopus. How can we help fight, how can nature help us fight terrorism and things of that nature? It was written by this biologist called Rafe Sagarin, and it was, it kind of struck a chord with me. I went to pick it up. I'm a real big fan of things like Emergence by Stephen Johnson and The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. Is anybody familiar with The Wisdom of Crowds, by the way? A couple. So here's my kind of like advice. If anybody's in InfoSec, pick this book up. It's really, really good. And the next part, this latter half of this talk is going to be me kind of, hopefully, connecting some dots in terms of how this relates to, how this kind of adaptation scheme relates to business adaptation. I want to talk a second about Wisdom of Crowds, because I really, really dug it. And it blends really well with some of the adaptation requirements that I'm going to bring up in a second. Wisdom of Crowds essentially states that when you have a big sample set of really interesting people, whether they're, and ranges of people, right, from lower intelligence to higher intelligence, just a nice, good sample set of people, that if you present them with a problem, collectively, the group will have better accuracy and in terms of solving that problem. And the example that I want to give is the USS Scorpion, which was I believe the only nuclear sub that we ever lost. At the time, this was like '68, I believe. So at the time, the director of the Navy basically said, he gave this challenge to everybody within the organization, and anybody could participate, from generals to custodians. Said, give me your individual best guess as to what happened to the sub and where do you think it went down based on its last radio communications. Now, this is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So that challenge went out and got back all these results, and nobody was even close in terms of when they actually found the sub. However, the collective answer, when they kind of like merged all of the answers together, ended up being, and I believe it was 225 yards away from the actual location of the downed sub on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. That's mind-blowing, I think. But anyway, so yeah, Wisdom of Crowds, Adaptability. So he talks, this Sagarin gentleman talks about the benefits of decentralized and distributed systems, right? So multiple sensors, no preconceived notions, and specialized tasks are all kind of the required variables to have these types of adaptable systems. And I'll talk about multiple sensors in a second, because that ties in with a lot of our security awareness issues in terms of corporate security awareness programs. And when I say security awareness programs, I'm not talking about your little SOX check mark. I'm talking about true blue security awareness programs. Because a buddy of mine from Cleveland, Dave Kennedy, some of you may know, he made a really, really great point about security awareness, which is, I would much rather have an entire system of intrusion detection sensors, right? Meaning all that goes so much further than our traditional controls in terms of alerting upon weird behavior, right? Potential malicious behavior. There we go. To have success in an adaptive state, in an adaptive environment, these things really have to, these are basically your requirements. You need a challenge, right? And this relates to getting out of your comfort zone again. You need to have resources, and you need to be able to prioritize the information that you are getting in, right, from your sensors, et cetera. Symbiosis is a very important adaptive trait. And basically you have three types of symbiosis. Mutualistic, which means both parties are benefiting. Commensalism, one party benefits, the other's not affected. And parasitic, which one party benefits, the other suffers. Now, these reactions, it develops into essentially an organizational structure, and emergent properties not only transform the environment but transform the organism. And that's a little vague, but I think you'll kind of see where I'm going with this when I finish this, or when I get through this. Natural security strategies here, right? A lot of this is kind of, of course, learning is key to an adaptive survival. Redundancy is obvious, but basically, when we talk about needing to reduce uncertainty and create uncertainty for adversaries, that's almost a strategy that today we're promoting. Or we need to further promote, because creating uncertainty for your adversaries, right? So honeypots is a great example, right? How can we now take these ideas and apply them to the business? Realistically, delaying an operation, and increasing the potential for error, right? Social engineering, that's perfect for that. The problem with walls, right? Like I said, most organizations are looking for inexpensive, effective controls to solve problems, right? We're going to prevent BYOD, or we're going to manage BYOD, or APT, or cyber whatever, right? I might as well just bring up Art of War and Paradigm Shift to make sure I drink the rest of the night. But the great analogy, though, here is in terms of, these are all static controls, and static controls are eventually going to fail, right? You're going to be able to get beyond the firewall. The levees in New Orleans are going to, overflow or break in some way, shape, or form. There are all sorts of different ways to bypass these things. And again, there's a great analogy. One of the really good analogies in the book is he talks about this jumping spider, right? There's this jumping spider that mimics the olfactory whatever of this type of ant. And therefore it can get into the anthill. And then it mimics the stroke, which communicates. It's like stroking the ant that's carrying the larvae, and that stroke is the communication of, hey, I'll take that over for you. And so the ant drops the larvae, and the spider picks it up, and boom, now we've got a free meal, right? What do we call that in the InfoSec industry? Social engineering, right? It's easy. So, again, the problem with walls, right? They're static. We need to be more dynamic in terms of protecting the business, right? But we're not going to just leave things alone and figure out and watch things naturally decay or naturally break. There has to be something in the middle. You know, again, how can we be more natural and build dynamic actual living security systems? We're pretty smart as a species. We need to be able to kind of figure all this stuff out, right? But even though we as a species are really good at adapting individually, we have created systems and institutions that are completely unadaptable or non-adaptable. Remember, adaptation occurs when you get out of your comfort zone. And one of the primary reasons our business infrastructure doesn't adapt well to the changing environments of today's internet threats is the fact that most of our business culture is comfortable where they're at, right? Generating revenue, distributing profit, things of that nature. There's no incentive to get out of that comfort zone and begin to adapt to prevent, let's say, access of business critical data. So the challenge, right? How do we design systems that can deal with security problems and respond more organically and automatically, right? What I want to do in the next couple of slides is, in addition to this, in addition to these, this data here, I want to get some feedback as well from, the people sitting in here in terms of what kind of interesting ideas do your organizations do that might stimulate some of this decentralized and adaptation kind of information, right? But information usage here. Using information, basically, organisms need to seek to reduce uncertainty for themselves and increase uncertainty for their adversaries. So I kind of touched on that earlier in terms of being able to create types of uncertainty and unpredictability, but using information in survival situations, right? That's when we adapt. When we're in survival situations. And when we're just kind of in our comfort zone, that adaptation doesn't happen. Unpredictability is really about increasing the costs for our adversaries, right? The concept of adversary ROI, and again, I'm stealing a lot from Josh Corman here. This is one of his things. Adversarial ROI, right? Increasing or decreasing the return on investment for your adversaries as they are trying to attack you, okay? If we can design systems that basically prevent those people looking to steal your intellectual property or business critical data, if those systems are designed such that it's just enough to blow the return on investment, because let's not mince words here. Data theft is big business, right? There's a lot of resources that go into it, but every business needs to show an ROI. So if we can kind of lower that ROI for the adversaries, that's an interesting, strategy that organizations need to consider. Competition and cooperation. So this is, and again, what I like about something like this, right, these cons, is that there's a lot of cooperation and information sharing that really kind of lends itself to this point, okay? Competition between organisms leads to cooperation, or it can in many instances, okay? So, you have individual organisms that are, let's say, looking for food, and then, if they team up and cooperate, they get better at doing that, right? So, once that kind of group cooperation has been established, now that group has a much better chance at being more successful than other groups. However, when that happens, you also have that sign of now, competition between groups then yields even greater cooperation within groups. And that's part of the adaptive life cycle. Okay, that's how, from an important feature perspective, cooperative networks emerging naturally, right, and not mandated. They're designed to solve specific problems. Specific problems, though. We're not talking about solving world peace, okay? So cooperating and being able to, and basically having a problem to solve with a large enough, with a good sample set of organisms or people or whatever we want to talk about, that's how cooperative networks really contribute to the adaptation life cycle. Talks about adaptable cascades. I'm just going to go over this real quick. Creating decentralized organizations of multiple independent problem solvers. The goal really is to achieve adaptability cascades that effectively can deal with security problems by organically responding and overcoming problems as they occur, as opposed to reactionary static type of controls that we have today. The basics, though, from an adaptation perspective, are kind of, it's not rocket science, right? So think of the organization that you work in today, right? Are you in an environment where you are presented with problems to solve as opposed to being given directives, okay? Because when you're given a directive, that assumes that there's one solution, as opposed to having a group of really smart people look at a problem and figure out probably what is going to end up being the more elegant solution, right? Again, that whole wisdom of crowds kind of mentality. Monetary incentives, oddly enough, or not oddly enough, monetary incentives are even better at stimulating the group kind of think tank. There's the Iowa, I think it's called the Iowa Electronic Markets, is a nonprofit organization that they basically say, okay, we're going to talk about and monitor elections, okay? So who do you think is going to win this particular election? Now, in order to strip out the politics, there's a monetary incentive, right? If you're right, you get $1 or you get $10 or something like that. And once your actual kind of, wherever you stand politically, once that's out of the equation, the results are staggeringly accurate in terms of predicting who's going to win either, from the presidential elections all the way down to city council and things of that nature, right? So monetary incentives are actually really good. So from a business perspective, and this is kind of wrapping all this up into one little ball here, instead of security strategies that are geared towards designing solutions, we need to think about how can we make that adapting solutions, right? Moving away from giving orders, providing challenges, the really outstanding solutions come from that adaptation groupthink. So before I kind of, see if there are any questions, comments, I'd like to get a little feedback from anybody in here. Are you involved in any type of initiative within your organization that allows for this type of communal, almost sensory, programs? Does anybody have anything like that within their organization? Nobody? Interesting. I don't know. You tell me. I mean, does this make any sense? I'm getting booted off. I'll be right over there. Yeah, I got to get ready for the next. But thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.